Hey everyone, with this video I do want to give you an example of why it's so important to shoot HDR images. For this example we are going to turn this shot into this image using a bit of Photoshop. If you want to follow along, you can find the needed raw files in the description of the video. And now let's jump into it. So here we are in the Camera Raw editor. And you can see we are working with a very contrast-rich scene. You can see that looking at the histogram, there's a lot of overexposure and a lot of underexposure. Depending on what camera you use, you might have a little more dynamic range, but if I try to fix the highlights, for example, by bringing down the highlights, this just doesn't work, as well as bringing up the shadows. At a first glance, this might look good to you, but there's a lot of noise going on. Since I was shooting this on a rather cheap drone, so instead of just using a single file, we are making use of an HDR sequence. And this image is part of it as a middle exposure. Then we have a darker shot for the highlights and a brighter shot to recover details from the shadows. We just need to combine those three images. And that is really easily done in the Camera Raw editor as well as in Lightroom. You just need to select all the images of the HDR sequence. Then right-click on one of them and choose Merge to HDR. So here you have the options to automatically align the images, which I would recommend. And then you can also apply auto settings, which I usually not tend to use. But if I need to get a better idea of what I can do with an image, you can always go ahead and apply these auto settings. For this shot, however, let's turn it off. And once you set up this HDR merging process, just hit the merge button. Once the Camera Raw editor has finished this, you will end up with something like this. Now this doesn't look different from the middle exposure of the HDR sequence, but we have a lot more dynamic range. So what this means is we can safely pull down the highlights and this way just restore them. At the same time we can pull up the shadows quite a bit without introducing any extra noise and making this image look weird. And we can also bring up the exposure for the same effect and just restore those very needed details in the darkest parts of the image. Wonderful. Now in this case you can still see this area on the right side in the sky is kind of blown out, but I do want to keep it this way for now. I will fix the most extreme areas later with a bit of Photoshop, but at this point I'm quite happy with it. Now besides those adjustments, I do want to change the profile going from Adobe Color to Adobe Landscape, which will bring up the saturation of the image some more. And I also want to adjust the white balance, giving this image some more of a golden hour shot. So I'm going to bring up the temperature, just adding a lot more warmth to it, and that looks great. Now let's also introduce some texture, and I'm going to drop the clarity very slightly to add some dreamy effect on top of it. And for the same reason, I'm going to bring down the dehaze. Of course, negative dehaze will also make the image brighter, which does have a negative effect on this area, but as I said, I will fix that later in Photoshop. For now, what I also want to do is to kind of fix the horizontal lines. You can see these are not really straight. And how I'm doing this is I'm going all the way down into the geometry tab, and here I'm using the horizontal slider and just slightly bring it down, just so we can level this building in the center. Perfect. And since we have adjusted the horizontal slider, we do need to crop the image, which I already have done, as you can see, just taking a bit away from the left and from the top. Now back to the editing. We have done the basic adjustments. You can see they were pretty impactful since we are working with an HDR image and we restored a ton of details from the darkest areas. Now I do want to put some more focus on a few areas locally. That means we need to do some masking. And first off, I do want to make the blue part of the sky darker. And for that reason, let's try a color range mask. I'm just clicking right there in the blue area. And of course, this is selecting way too much. So we gotta make use of that refine slider, bringing it further down until we get something that's looking like a proper selection. Just like that. And with that mask, let's bring down the exposure slightly, just to introduce some contrast to the sky. Next up, I do want to further tweak the sky using another linear gradient on top of it, just like that, covering most of the left side. And I try to not affect the right side where the bright sunlight is coming in. So with this linear gradient, again, I'm just bringing down the exposure. And again, thanks to the HDR sequence we have merged, we have a lot more room to play with thanks to the higher dynamic range of this file. So let's see, how can we make use of that? I think we can make the building in the center a little brighter without risking too much noise being introduced. So let's create a select subject mask. As you can see, this is doing a pretty good job, but I don't want to have that tree on the left selected. So what I'm doing here is to say subtract and choose linear gradient. Then I'm just subtracting the tree from that building. You can also say subtract brush and do a little finer adjustments to this mask, but I think we are good for now. In here, I just want to slightly bring up the exposure and maybe add a little bit of contrast. Because if you're making this building too bright, it's way too obvious that we have changed it. But this is looking pretty good. Now, one more thing I want to do is to add some extra glow coming in from the right, and like always, I'm just going to use a radial gradient. Make it nice and big like this, and I'm making sure the center of the radial gradient lies outside of the image to get a natural effect. And in here, let's bring up the blacks all the way, and I'm going down to the effects tab and also bring down the dehaze. Again, this will introduce more overexposure, but as I said, I will fix that later with a bit of Photoshop. One more thing I want to add is some color in here. I could adjust the temperature, but I don't like the effect of this. So instead, I'm clicking on this little color box. And I want to have a warm color tone coming from the right side. So let's set up the hue to something warm. And I think I want to bring up the saturation, so the color is actually visible. Just like that. Wonderful. And here we have the image after the masking adjustments. Let me toggle the visibility from before to after. You can see the focus now lies way more on that church in the center thanks to all those local adjustments. Next up, we also want to do a bit of color grading, so let's head down into the color mixer. First, I want to start with the saturation. I do want to bring up the warmer tones, so let's raise orange and yellow. And at the same time, I feel like the green tones are a little too strong, so I'm going to bring them down. Wonderful. And at this point, we could even bring up the blue tones just to get some more color variety in this image. Okay, awesome. Then I do want to switch over to the luminance tab, and here I just want to bring down the blue luminance, making the sky a little darker and thus just adding some more contrast up there. For this scene, a little bit of split toning might help quite a lot as well, so let's apply this. First off, the highlights. Since we're working with the golden hour shot, I am going to apply warm color tones to the highlights and the midtones. So let's set up the hue. And let's bring up the saturation. That looks great. Let's do the same for the midtones. Again, set up the hue first and then bring up the saturation. Wonderful. Now, one more thing I want to do with the color grading. In the calibration tab all the way down, I just want to drop the blue primary hue slightly and bring up the saturation some more. Perfect. Now we're almost done, just need to do a little bit of sharpening in the details tab. And as always, I'm using the same settings, bring down the radius, increase the details. The only thing that not has a set value is the masking. I'm just holding down the Alt key and check the image, so only the subject will get sharpened like that. And then we can bring up the amount of sharpening as well. Wonderful, and that's the HDR image after just a few raw adjustments. Before, after. And we would have never achieved the same quality result like this by just using a single raw file. This is all thanks to the HDR sequence we have merged earlier. So from this point on, we can finalize this image using a bit of Photoshop. So let's open up this object. So what I want to do first is to kind of fix a few skewed lines. You can see right down here, this is looking very strange. So let's try to fix that. I'm going to hit Ctrl J on that layer to create a duplicate and thus create a backup layer in case I mess something up. Then I'm hitting Ctrl T to bring up the transformation settings and right click in the image and choose warp. Now the warp tool might not be the best tool to fix those lines, but I think this might work quite well. And what I'm doing here is to just click in the image, try to unskew this line down below. And I'm just applying some very tiny adjustments to not overdo it. You can see when I deactivate this layer, this has fixed most of it without affecting the rest of the image too much. So I think that's looking pretty good. Next up, as I said, I want to fix those blown out highlights in the top right corner. To do that, I will make use of the TK panel plugin. So first off, let's create a new layer. I'm not changing the blending mode, but let's head into the TK panel plugin. And as I said, this is a paid plugin, but there's a free version available with a few less functions. But it should be fine for the purpose of this tutorial if you want to try it. So I want to just target the brightest highlights in here, which I want to change. This means I'm using the lights 6 mask. Clicking on it, you can see how we nicely can select those areas. And all we need to do now is to apply this as a layer mask on our new layer. And what I want to do now is to grab the brush, pick a warm color tone from the sky somewhere here, which is not too dark and not too bright. This seems about perfect. And with this brush, I'm just going to paint over that blown out part and thus make it look less blown out. The difference is very subtle, but if you're looking for those spots, this is a huge difference. Before, after. Looks much more professional. Alright, then I also want to apply a little bit of dodging, enhancing those highlights on the trees. Again, I'm creating a new layer and this time I'm switching the blending mode to overlay. Again, I'm making use of the TK panel plugin, and since I want to target the highlights, I'm simply going with the lights 2 mask. Since I don't want to change the sky, I also want to mask out the sky of this layer mask. So let's select the bottom picture and go to select, choose sky. With the sky selection, I'm going back to the layer mask, hit Shift F5 and choose black. So now only really the highlights of the foreground are selected. Then let's pick up the brush by pressing B, set the foreground color to white, maybe bring down the brush opacity. Now I'm just starting to paint over all those trees to enhance the highlights. Again, a very subtle change, but let me deactivate the layer so you can see the difference before, after. Let's merge everything. For that, I'm going to hit Ctrl Shift Alt E, which will put every layer into a new merged layer. With this one, I want to apply some kind of autumn glow effect. A few videos ago, I showed you a different technique. This time, however, I want to use the Nik Collection plugin. So let's go to Filter, Nik Collection, Color Effects Pro 4. Again, this is a paid plugin, but it's very useful and I really recommend buying this one. So with this, I am going to use the Glamour Glow effect, as you can see, which just adds a very nice glow effect on top. And I can also improve the glow warmth. You can see I pushed it a little higher and I can bring up the saturation some more. So before, after. Let's apply it like this. I could bring down the opacity just a bit so we get a more natural look. So let's drop it slightly. I think we're in a good place right here. Then I do have a feeling I want to make the highlights still a bit more brighter in the foreground. So again, just create a new layer, switch the blending mode to overlay, open up the TK panel and use the lights 2 mask. Again, I'm masking out the sky here. So go to select sky and fill the selection with black on that layer mask. Then grab the brush tool, set the foreground color to white and bring up the brush opacity. And with that brush, I'm just again painting over all those highlights in the foreground. Perfect. And finally, I do want to add a little more vibrance. So let's go into the adjustment layers and choose vibrance. I'm just bringing up the vibrance slider a notch. And here we have it. So that is the final HDR image. I hope this Photoshop tutorial was useful and interesting. If you have any questions left, as always, feel free to ask in the comments, and thank you so much for watching this video.